Thank you all for coming today. The Tuesday Talk presentation for today is Quilts for All Seasons and Reasons by Marilyn Rembolt. Please welcome Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you for coming inside on such a lovely day. I've been quilting for a while, and I think people always are curious, how did you start quilting? And I'd say the biggest influence on my interest in sewing came from my maternal grandmother. And this is a photograph in 1974 of my grandmother in San Antonio. And I want you to notice two things about the picture. The garment she's wearing is a jumpsuit out of a petite cotton fabric that she bought in Hawaii that is now quilting material for me. I'll point it out in a couple of quilts. And she is not smiling. She didn't like her teeth. And so if she knew you were taking her picture, she would not smile. Every portrait she had done, she's not smiling. But she made this quilt for me. I never knew her to be a quilter. I had no recollection of, I was not a quilter when she was alive. So this quilt she made for me when I was about 3. And until my mother cleaned out her possessions out of her house, she said, well, you're the quilter in the family, and in fact, Grandma made that for you when you were about 3. But it's been through all of my siblings and all of my nieces and nephews, so it's seen some use, and the batting is just lumps here and there. It's not quilted enough. And in 1995, I became absorbed. I was sort of a baby quilter, and I became involved with a group of ladies who taught me how to hand quilt and how to do things right. I'll show you some examples where I haven't been doing things quite right. But I think of these as older ladies, but they're about my age now. And only one of them is still alive. But this quilt I have shown here before, so you may have seen it, but these basket blocks I also inherited from my mother amongst my grandmother's possessions. And no one else in the family, of course, wanted some quilt blocks, and so I decided that I would finish this quilt, and I did hand quilt it because I had learned how to do it properly now. So it took me 20 years to finish it, but I finished it last year, and I did some fairly extensive quilting on the plain blocks. And the reason you can see the quilting is my pencil marks still show. So that's the one thing I hadn't figured out yet on that one. But the reason I wanted to start quilting basically came about 1982 when we built our new house, which was 40 years ago. And I decided I needed some seasonal decor. And so I bought a book that I'll have Jim pass around next. By the way, this is my husband. This is his first time doing this. Came from a book called Quilts for All Seasons. And I thought I would make all of the quilts in the book, but I picked the easiest one first because I knew how to sew. I thought, how hard can this be? So I picked the easiest one to start with, and it took me 4 years to finish it because it's hand applique, hand quilted, and I thought, I'm not going to get through 12 of these. But as my skills improved, I didn't end up doing 3. This was the last one that I did, and I finally think I could make any of the 12 in the book, but I kind of lost interest in doing the ones that were in the book. And probably my best seasonal decor is this quilt, which is sort of a lecture all on its own. because it's based on a note card of watercolor that I saw in a magazine. And Sheila, if you want to start that other thing around. Yeah. That kind of shows the process. But before I could make this quilt, I needed to have several educational steps. And I had previously taken a class with Carol Breyer-Fallard. And she taught, it was the best class I ever took for what I wanted to do with quilting. And this is a picture of a lily that I found in Nebraska Land magazine. And I just want to explain this process very briefly because it's the basis of many of the quilts that you will see toward the end. This is a tracing. She taught me anything you can make a cartoon from or simple tracing you can make a quilt from. So this is the tracing of that lily. And this is the lily in progress. The top finished, and then that's the final quilt. Doesn't quite look like the lily, but then we were told to bring minimal fabric, and so that's what I had to work with. So I decided I was going to make an orange lily. Then the reason that most people make quilts is you need bedding. So as a baby quilter, I took a log cabin workshop, and we exchanged 1.5-inch strips of fabric and started sewing them together. And the first, I think, 8 blocks that I finished from the class were all so different in size. I finally discovered I really did need to kind of figure out what that 1/4 inch was all about. But I ended up making a king-size quilt with, I don't know if this, I just made up the settings, so I don't know, there may be one very similar and maybe actually has a name somewhere, because nothing is new under the sun, really. But I did quilt this quilt on my domestic sewing machine with a Baptist fan design. And yes, if you look at it, it is not perfect, but it still works, and it's quilted enough that it can withstand laundering. Then recently, I became interested in a quilt that I saw at a quilt show by Victoria Finley Wolf with this herringbone pattern, and I was intrigued with it. So I got her book, Modern Magic, and it's a digital copy, so I can't pass that one around. But I didn't want to do anything quite like her samples in the book were. Either the strips were too small or the quilt wasn't big enough. So to figure out how to make a king-size quilt out of the strip size I wanted to do with her method, I made several children's size quilts. And actually my grandson has one similar to this. And so that I could decide how many strips, how long is that end up being, and how wide does each column make. And if I want the king-size quilt, then I knew how many to do. So this is my most recent bed quilt that I made in 2020. And this was the first and last time that I had every piece of fabric decided, every piece cut out, and all I had to do were sew the columns together. And I thought, we did this on a vacation trip where I was able to take my sewing machine, but had only a tiny space to sew in. And I thought if I just got the columns done, that would be good. But I ended up sewing the entire top on the trip. And then COVID hit. And so I was stuck at home, and I finally decided, you know what? I am going to finish quilting that quilt. So I set a goal of quilting. I quilted the little zigzag rows. And so I made a goal. There were 30 rows, and I said, I'll have it done in a month if I can do 1 row a day. So that's what I did. Another reason that I make quilts is to preserve memories. And this next quilt is not one of my new ones, but as I was going through photographs for another quilt, I kept running across these trick-or-treat outfits from each year and decided they needed to be a quilt. So this was in the early days of photographs needed to be transferred with this sort of plastic, had to be reversed and then copied onto a special paper that you then transferred to the fabric, and there's kind of a plastic layer, so if you stitch through the photograph, it leaves holes. So even though these small photographs worked well for this, anything very large, I decided really wasn't very usable for this particular method. Thank you, Sheila. So this is a picture of my grandmother when she was smiling. And the only reason she was smiling, it was a group photograph. We were all sitting around the table at some holiday dinner. And this is the way she normally looked. She was smiling, but once you blew the picture up, it wasn't a very clear picture. But I did take a class using Fusible Method. And I'm not crazy about the Fusible Method still. I keep trying it, but it just is not something that I'm crazy about. But that is the orange fabric, the orange-red fabric you saw her wearing earlier, and I decided she had to wear that fabric in this portrait. Another memory, it was actually a challenge, but I'm in a group that has challenges. We'll talk about that reason later. But the challenge was to put a favorite game from your childhood. And I just couldn't think of anything other than cards, because our family played a lot of cards for after holiday meals. It was like, clear the table, we're gonna play cards. And the person who instigated it most frequently was my mother. She was an avid card player. And we played a game called Dirty Spades. So I decided my mother should be represented on the queen, so she was the queen of Dirty Spades. And as I used her, she had a number of very vintage cards laying around when we cleaned out her possessions. And so I designed this from a vintage queen card. And all of the queens were, in their one hand, either had a spear or a floppy flower. And I decided my mother would not like either one of those. If she was going to hold something in her hand, it had to be 4 aces. So these are actually fabric copies. So they're actually individual cards, but they're made from fabric, the photocopies of the original cards. And then there's ultra suede. There's vintage lace that a friend gave me to use sometime, and I thought, perfect. So you may want to take a look at this one closer up. Plus, it also has memories of a river cruise we went on, because I think I did all of the beading that I added to this quilt on that river cruise. It's just the fabric of a parcheesi board or something. So this is a detail of the cards and the beading. Then another challenge was, the theme was called passages. And to me, passages were generational. And so it started with a generation that was no longer alive, with my great-grandmother and her sister, my grandmother and her baby brother, and my mother and her sister, and then myself as a child with my sister. I actually had another sister, but she was an infant at the time, so she wasn't out playing on the sidewalk. And then my daughters and my granddaughters. So I named the quilt Sisters. I thought I could get by with one little boy because he was still wearing a dress. Okay, another reason I make quilts is to commemorate life events. And of course, you know, grandchildren all need a quilt. So this is a granddaughter on a play mat that I made for them. And then another event that I commemorated with a number of quilts for my siblings is a grandma quilt. Every grandma needs a quilt, whether it's for the grandchildren when they visit or when they need a nap themselves. I was told it works well for that too. I'm not a napper personally, but the next reason we make quilts, this one is a sort of a joke, you know. Use up scraps and the leftovers. But this quilt is based on I was in charge of a raffle quilt one year, and this was one block out of the 12 that was in it that I decided I wanted to do a little something with. And we also had these black flying geese blocks that people donated, and I made a number of them, and there were several left over. So these were the leftovers that I decided needed a new home, and it sat unquilted for a long time. And then this last year or so, I was looking through things that I told myself either finish them or get rid of them, and decided I wanted to do some, I ran onto a lady who was doing some really extensive quilting, and I thought, I wouldn't mind trying that, but I don't want to do it on anything very big. And I thought, when do I have that I could put that quilting on? And I thought, aha, I have just the quilt. It was already kind of dimensionally quilted, but not around in the background. But because I like a fair amount of quilting, and so this made a perfect place to try that. Then also, I was going through my scraps and really trying to say, do you really need to keep this scrap? Because my box was full. And I kept pulling small pieces out, and I thought, this wouldn't be bad in a little landscape quilt. And then I started looking for the fabrics that would work into a small landscape quilt. And so this one, let's see, it's only 10 inches wide. So these are very small scraps, but it makes quite a lovely quilt by my front door where I need a narrow spot. Okay, political and social statements are not really something that I do very often, but many quilters do. And my best protest quilt was from my days as a university student. When I came to the University of Nebraska, I thought I was in an enlightened period in 1965, but found out that I was not allowed to be in the marching band because I was not a guy. And I thought that was really unfair. And my poor husband has heard this so many times. He said,
bragged about it 100 times.
And if the truth be known, I had a part-time job that I needed to keep that required me to work on football Saturdays. So that would have been a direct conflict to being in the marching band, and I might not have been able to actually do it, but it just irked me that I couldn't try out. I was not allowed to even have that choice. So that is my political statement. Okay, gifts or charity is another reason that we like to make quilts, and I have made a lot of them, but don't have most of them. And this one I did not, was not able to bring, but I have won these windmill blocks in an exchange, and they were just something that I thought, what am I going to do with these? They laid around for a long time, and I finally decided just to put other scraps with them and put them together, and I really learned if you put enough different things together, I think it turned out quite nice, actually. And some child, I'm sure, is enjoying it. Then my most recent fundraising type gift was to the Sunflowers for Ukraine fundraiser that the museum sponsored along with the Rotary International. So this quilt is still hanging on 3rd floor. If anybody would like to go up, you can actually see this quilt up there. So most of the rest of these are what I call challenges, or what if I did this or that. So I enjoy doing a lot of challenge quilts. This first one was a state challenge, and I had taken a class where we made these Bargello type wedges And if you made 3 sets of these wedges, you get a circle. And when I saw that, I thought, that looks like a giant flower. And about this same time, this challenge came up, and I thought of making, let's see, some of the other requirements. You had to have a mariner's compass block, non-traditional fabrics were required, or a non-traditional fabric was required, and then a particular challenge fabric. And the challenge fabric is the one in the center of the giant wedge. The non-traditional fabric is this kind of dull purple. It was a drapery fabric. And then I actually went further with it and added these little ultra suede 3-dimensional pieces onto it. But I thought I named this one Hope Meets Audrey the Second, or Audrey was the man-eating plant. So it was about that same time, and so that was also on my mind. And so the orange fabric in this one was from my grandmother Hope's garment, so that's where Hope meets Audrey. And I also enjoy hand-dyed fabric, and so the leaves are my hand-dyed fabric. Then the Lincoln Guild had a literary challenge where we were to represent a book, and I was a big quilt magazine reader, but not a real book reader. And Jim subscribed to a booklet that I don't remember the name of, but it was full of little quotes. He used to send things to his partners in the office as a inspirational or motivational little pieces. And one of them one day I ran across, I had to save, and it was a quote by H. Jackson Brown Jr., which read, "Talent without discipline is like an octopus on roller skates. There's plenty of movement, but you never know if it's going to be forwards, backwards, or sideways." And that just made such a visual picture. I thought that has to be a quilt, because I felt like I was kind of that octopus on roller skates a lot of times. And there is major embellishment on this quilt. I left the detail out. The roller skates are the challenge fabric, and then the wheels themselves are made with Fimo clay. So, and then the beads finish the quote, that are the smaller beads, kind of look like bubbles. Okay, the next quilt was a challenge quilt by the Lincoln Guild in 2012, and it was called Let Your Sparkle Out. So the sparkle in this quilt, I think they're called Hishi mirrors, I may be wrong, but they're Shisha mirrors? Okay. But they are actually little mirrors that then with thread work you can attach them. And one of the bases for this challenge was it could not be a square or rectangular. It had to be an odd shape. It didn't say it couldn't be symmetrical, so it is symmetrical. And then I was looking for an exotic flower to make a quilt with when I was happened to be in Houston, and the newspaper had a photograph of what looked like a really exotic flower. It was in black and white. So it wasn't until I got home and could look up more about this. It's actually a noxious weed. So I call this a beauty but a beast, because it's actually my interpretation of Jimson weed or loco weed. And I used, the coloration is not accurate, because for this challenge I have this red fabric that I drew out of a bag, and so I had to use that red fabric, and the actual Jimson weed would be a pale lavender. So just imagine it being pale lavender if you want to know what it really looks like. But this, of course, is quite large. The Jimson weed is a trumpet-shaped flower that only opens at night. It's part of the nightshade family. It's also known as stinkweed, locoweed, or moonflower, and is a poisonous plant. It can cause sensory deprivation and hallucinations. The effects of taking Jimson weed seeds can last for days. Overdoses can lead to seizures, coma, and respiratory arrest. Few use it twice. The next challenge was, I'm pleased to be a part of a group of women from Lincoln and Omaha that have an interest in creating fiber art, and this was one of their challenges, entitled Closure. And I just kept thinking of a zipper. So this one is, except for the black and white, is all hand-dyed fabric as well. But as it kept developing, I decided, it needed more embellishment. So there's some antique buttons and some new buttons, and then I had to make a three-dimensional zipper pull. I was also a part of a group that was asked to help commemorate the one-room schoolhouse at an exhibit. And so I made this quilt. Jim, you became a spectator.
Here it is.
So, but I based this one, this was from 2019, but I based it on remembrances and stories that my mother and grandmother told about. And as a child, I remembered how odd it must have been to go to a one-room schoolhouse. I came from a small town, but we had actually grades in a different room for every classroom. But I remember talking about the penmanship, and I still can remember the penmanship alphabet on the top of the chalkboard. My mother's favorite thing was to be good enough that they let her clean the eraser board. So I had to put the eraser in there, and then talking about, filling the bucket and everybody drinking out of the same dipper in the classroom. So that is my interpretation of the one-room schoolhouse memories. I don't have this quilt here, Sheila, so this quilt also was at a time when I was starting another little direction that I have gone, using my iPad to create art that becomes a part of the quilt. I didn't point it out with my sister's one, but that was also done using the iPad to just, so the photographs weren't just real photographs, they had been, the little textures and things were added to it. So if you look at them later, you can notice that. This is a whole cloth quilt. There is beading on it to embellish, but before I go on, I want to point out on the bottom, you'll see a painting of a dancing crane. And I was originally going to make just a silhouette of a crane. And so I was looking on the internet for a crane that I wanted to make the silhouette of. And I found this painting. I found a couple actually, and one of the people I never could get a hold of to get permission to use the painting. But this one was done by Narka Moore Craig, and I was able to get a hold of her and tell her I wanted to extract just the crane part of her painting to use it in a quilt, and she said sure. So I thank her for that. But what I did was, with my iPad, got rid of the background, which you see is minimal there, and then created a new background where I just took actually some well, it was several processes of things on the iPad. It started out with hand-dyed fabric, and then it went through another app, and then I finally went through one where you can make pixels out of it. So very pixelated, it became the background. And I thought this would be so simple to do, but the squares, the pixels are about 3/8 of an inch, and stitching between them looks like it is pieced, but it was really a pain to quilt it. Because if you got off just a little bit, it didn't look good. Okay, so my Fiberworks group next had a challenge of we had to represent a bird, avian, and I had already done the crane, so I thought I don't want to do another crane, and I wanted to do something that represented Nebraska, so to me the obvious one was the Meadowlark. And this one I did in a similar way, where I found a video from, it wasn't Audubon, but it was a nature conservancy, of a video where the Meadowlark was chirping, and I was able to screen grab that from that video and pull the Meadowlark out, and then created another background with 2 or 3 processes with apps on my iPad. And that fabric was also printed by Spoonflower. So the pieces were all put together, and then down at the bottom there's some heavy thread work to create the nest. Meadowlarks are easier to identify by their sound because they're difficult to find. So this Meadowlark kind of fits that. He's a little incognito. So this was a challenge that I participated in for the Lincoln Quilt Guild, and it was for a quilt show that never happened because of COVID as well, but they decided to go ahead and do the challenge. So I originally hadn't planned to even enter anything because I couldn't think of anything, and then at the last minute I got an idea, so I kind of threw it together, but I want to do something more on this line at some point because it was a lot of fun to do. Okay, another reason that I find that I enjoy doing quilts, it's fun to share quilts with the public so they understand quilts don't have to be on a bed. So the group I alluded to before, Fiberworks, Sheila Green is a member of that group. And in fact, this photograph is by Sheila. Thank you, Sheila. I didn't ask permission to use it today. But this was one of our exhibits where we drew a crayon color, and my quilt is the green one that's partially a leaf. It's a partial leaf. It's a leaf that I took a picture of in Costa Rica that was ginormous. So it's almost life size in the quilt itself, which is, this wide And we have exhibited here at the museum a time or two, and that's always special for us to have our quilts hanging in the gallery. This was from 2015. And we currently have an exhibit in Omaha, 2 exhibits actually. One of them is called The Rule of 3. And my quilt are these 3 pairs. And that was a new technique. I always like to try something new. If it's something I've done before, it's just a little less interesting to me. And the other exhibit that we have there is inspired by Chihuly. And this was inspired by not actually his glass work, but one of his paintings. He does paintings on like 2 layers of glass so that they're kind of move as you walk past them. And at the Jewish Community Center in Omaha. And they're there just through the end of the month.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Today could, or Friday.
Friday probably would be the last. So, just because is another reason I make quilts. And this quilt is from a technique that I didn't bring any of my early examples from, but it's a technique I learned from Brenda Grells, and she calls it photo expansion, where you take a photograph and then expand the picture into the quilt itself with fabric. So just the center part is the photograph of a vinca flower, which is very small, but it's quite large here. And I finished the quilt and thought I was done, and it hung in my house and I enjoyed it, and then it just kept telling me it wasn't quite done. So you can see in a couple places here, I went and added beads all the way around the photograph. And I think it kind of helped the quilt sparkle just a little bit. And another one that I've just been playing with recently, you're the first people to see it. It's called Raspberry Sky because the dye color that I used was called raspberry. And it was a takeoff from a class that I took online. She calls her method a watercolor look. And I decided with just the raspberry dye, it was kind of boring. So I decided my other favorite color, this funny color that's not really yellow and not really green, is sort of my favorite fabric. So it had to go in there. And then another of my quilts that you're also the first to see, was an attempt to show color transparency. So these are all, the black and it's actually light gray, it's not white, but the other background color, the black or the dark gray and the white are commercial fabrics. The rest are all my hand-dyed fabrics. But it shows the transparency that would happen if fabric was transparent. And I decided it needed something a little more. I wanted to do piping on the edges and thought, well, it's too late to do that now. And so I decided to put beads. So the piped edge is actually beads. Then the last quilt here is my most recent, and there's my favorite color again, that sort of funny yellow-green quilt, or fabric. And this is a series of pictures that kind of show its progress from the first picture. Parts of it are sewn together, but I haven't quite decided on the rest of the fabric that was going to be the background, so I was trying some different things out. Finally decided on this presentation of my hand-dyed fabric. And then I had it all sewn together and I thought it needs something more, and I thought of my circles that I have still left over from the other quilt that I put the applique circles on. So I put a bunch of circles and thought I was finally happy, and then I thought, no, there's too many of them. We need to edit out some of them. So what Sheila is showing you was the final decision, and it is now quilted. And I put beads around the edge of this one. I thought, I kind of enjoyed that last time. Let's do it one more time. So that's it. Any questions? Bonnie?
I went to the show in Omaha and was really interested that you used black and the brown, you dyed. The Shibuli one.
Oh, yeah, okay. It's not Pellon, it's Pellon-like. Yeah, it's a non-woven, I think it maybe is for interfacing of some sort. But that was from Betty Busby class, where we wadded it all up with paint and then spread it out, and then we put a fusible on the back, and then you cut it out and put it down. Once again, I keep trying these fusible things, but I'm not sure I'm really, they just don't like to be folded anymore once you put that fusible stuff on. So I do store most of my quilts on pool noodles, rolled up, for that reason, so they don't get a sharp end. Yes, Linda?
You talked about having background fabric printed by spoon flower.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of program or how did you do that?
Well, you do need a computer to upload to Spoonflower. I can't do that from my iPad, at least currently I haven't, I don't have that ability. But most of the fabric that I designed was designed on the iPad. And then I transfer it to the computer to upload it. But they have it down fairly simple. If you want a yard of fabric, though, you create a document that is the size of a yard of fabric. That's the most challenging part. If you only need a fat quarter, then the size of your document at 150 DPI is what they want. Then the size of your document is the size of the fat quarter. And that's the file that you then upload.
And what app on your iPad?
Oh, I have lots of them.
Lots.
That's the thing about apps. Each app only does one thing. I mean, a lot of them. Like the one that made the pixelation, it may do some other things, but the only one I liked was that. So it takes just a lot of playing. When I first took the first class to play with that kind of thing, we took a trip to Alaska that had a lot of time on the plane and a lot of time in the airport, and I played and played and played with photographs that I either took in Alaska. On the way home, I would be playing with those pictures or other pictures, and I thought, whoever would have that many pictures on their iPad? Well, now I do, because you can, and you better save it, because you can't go backwards. Once you close the app, you lose that, unless you say, yes, save this to my, camera roll. You won't save that thing. You can't go back and look at it later. At least most apps are that way. Because it lets you just play and play and play, and you aren't wasting paper, you aren't using up supplies of any kind. But if you think there's something in that product that you just made, you better save it. You can always delete it. But you can't go back to the one that was 2 times before that you asked it to do another process.
Well, Marilyn, how fun to see all your techniques. I love that you've explored so many interesting things, and I like seeing how your work has really advanced through all those different projects.
Well, it's been a fortunate thing. I mean, I first was, I forgot to point out on that very first bunny rabbit quilt that took me 4 years to finish, there's just this cheapest muslin on the back that almost is cheesecloth, and all my knots are just hanging out. Because everything I knew I learned on public television, and even though they were showing how to hand quilt, they never bothered with that little detail of how you were supposed to put the knot on the inside. So I was basically self-taught for a long time until I joined this one small group of the older ladies, but they were very generous and kind of holding my hand and showing me that, there also were quilt police, that it was okay to do things differently, but if you wanted to know the right way to do it, they would, share that as well. Or maybe the easier way to do it would be the better way to put that. Well, thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Marilyn, for coming and giving your talk. If you would like to see Marilyn's quilts up close, they are over there on these tables. And the volunteer meetings will get started in 10 to 15 minutes.